The Whigs, or specifically the Whig Party. So, before I actually get into the Whig Party, I do want to kind of rewind for just a second to the Panic of 1837. I mentioned it at the very end of the last PowerPoint, but basically, for over a decade, the economy of the United States had basically benefited from a favorable business cycle. Keep in mind that during that time period, there was easy credit, and with the availability of all kinds of territories being opened up out west, partly due to the whole Indian Removal Act and everything, a lot of people are buying land out in the west. And keep in mind, the west is still not as far west as what we view it today. And so the thing is, during this time period, Americans are basically going to pile up debt on the assumption that good times will never end. But they do. And so in 1836, the Bank of England is going to tighten its credit policies. And the thing is, by tightening its credit policies, this basically raises interest rates. By doing this, it's really going to reduce the credit lines of British merchants. Now you're going, how does that affect the United States? The problem is a lot of these British merchants, so suddenly it's tightening their credit so they can't, they're not being loaned as much and everything, and they're not being given as much, means that these British merchants who were heavily involved in American trade are going to cut back on what they're purchasing. And so what really is affected is the demand for cotton falls. If there's still the same amount of supply on the market, but demand falls, the price of a commodity falls, and so the price of cotton falls. This is going to cause economic issues around the United States. You then get a bank panic that kind of drags down on the economy. This causes bankruptcies to multiply, investment capital dries up, a lot of businesses stagnate. In fact, 9 states in the South and the West would default on their bonds. Now, there's a brief recovery in 1838, but then once again, the Bank of England is going to have another round of credit contraction that this time it's going to last closer until about like 1843-ish. It gets so bad that like actually up in the Northeast, unemployment would reach 20%. So the thing is, when things aren't going well, generally the political party not in power tends to do better. And so we're seeing that opponents to the Democrats are starting to come together as the Whig Party. And a lot of them are going to claim that, Jackson's destruction of the Bank of the United States had undermined business confidence. And a lot of them really wanted just a stronger role for the federal government or the national government when it comes to especially promoting like economic growth. One other thing I should mention about on these economic growth is the Specie Circular of 1836. This was actually put into being with Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson had basically gone against paper money when he issued the Specie Circular of 1836, which stipulated that these large tracts of land out west could only be bought with specie. Specie is basically like hard currency, like gold, silver kind of thing. The problem is this actually contributed to the Panic of 1837 because this means that people needed to transfer large amounts of specie out to the west to buy land there, just as like Eastern banks are strapped for reserves. Basically, people are hoarding specie on some level, and this puts less specie out in circulation, and with less money into circulation, there's less lines of credit. Like, you can see how this could affect multiple people in multiple parts of the economy. The Democrats really had this dilemma by getting involved in, destroying the Bank of the United States, and then by Jackson, having put it forward the Specie Circular and everything like that. They had, in effect, assumed this role as they were supposed to protect the people from banking and business communities by meddling. But now, having meddled, instead of having one monster bank, they had a lot of small banks that really needed to be regulated across the United States. And so in effect, they basically created a bunch of little monsters. But that didn't really limit their government power, and they didn't want to expand out the federal government power. And so more than anything else, basically the Democrats needed to make a clean break between government and banking. And so when Martin Van Buren is the president, he is going to come out in favor of the independent treasury system. This is where the government will basically dispense with banks entirely. This technically restores the ideological purity of like the Democrats as, oh, they're friends of honest money. But by pulling out completely from like banks, this is going to technically prolong the depression going on at this time. I also have to mention this. I'm going to go into a lot more details about slavery and those enslaved at this time later, but I just want to mention it so you can see it when it's happening and what is happening politically in this time period. Into 1831, we're seeing a new phase of Northern attacks on the institution of slavery. It's things like William Lloyd Garrison, who is an individual I'll talk about later a lot more. He publishes his abolitionist paper, The Liberator. We're also going to see abolitionists are embracing a doctrine of immediatism. Immediatism was basically the immediate moral commitment to begin work on emancipation. It means that immediately wanting emancipation, not wanting moderation with emancipation. They wanted all those enslaved to be emancipated. The thing is, a lot of this was actually inspired by that whole Second Great Awakening and the religious revivals of the late 1820s, where a lot of individuals now would view slavery as really the greatest sin of all. And so we're seeing this new phase of Northern attacks on slavery include things like a propaganda offensive in 1835. During this offensive, over 1 million pieces of anti-slavery literature would be sent to the South, and much of it would be sent actually through the United States mail. This was really alarming to the Southerners. Keep in mind, like, this was going down, and we just had like the whole nullification crisis, so you can see how the Southerners were concerned about slavery becoming an issue. And so Southerners were also really concerned about slave revolts, and so they would actually burn this propaganda with open approval by Jackson. And so they're basically censoring the mail to keep out anti-slavery materials. Abolitionists at that point would then focus their efforts more on Congress. For instance, in 1836 and throughout Martin Van Buren's presidency, they would put forward hundreds of thousands of like anti-slavery petitions into Congress. Most of these petitions were calling for things like the abolition of slavery in the District of Columbia, so Washington, D.C., the capital of the United States. But what this would end up doing is it would cause Southern congressmen to respond that, oh, free speech must be repressed for the sake of Southern white security. And so they're going to censor these petitions in the form of what is a gag rule. Basically, this was a procedural device where any anti-slavery petition was automatically tabled without any discussion. And the idea was that, oh, we'll get back to that later. But they don't. This gag rule, though, is going to really become identified with the Democratic Party in particular. And so now a lot of individuals are going to view the Democrats as like the pro-Southern party, the pro-slavery party. Ironically, though, actually both those who were abolitionists and those who were not saw Martin Van Buren as dangerous on the other side. So neither side really quite trusts Martin Van Buren. But back to the Whig Party. So the thing is, we are seeing the rise of the Whig Party partly because of this anti-Jacksonian sentiment. By 1834, these anti-Jacksonians started to call themselves Whigs. Keep in mind, hey, Whigs, you might go, I remember that. That is because it is the name associated with the 18th century American and British opponents to monarchical tyranny. So pulling back from history. By 1840, they are going to actually master techniques of like political organization and mobilization and run a much stronger candidate. The thing is, when this party took shape, a lot of it was really born in reaction to specifically Jackson's like bank veto and then the whole subsequent attacks on the National Bank. And so it probably comes as no surprise to you, one of the leaders of the Whig Party is Henry Clay. Another is going to be Daniel Webster, and he comes up later again. They were really upset, and not just them, but others who join in the Whig Party were upset by the specifics of like Jackson's policies, but they were also upset with how he basically enforces his will, like using executive power, and how he would do things like, for instance, the openly defying of the Supreme Court during the whole Indian removal. And then openly defying Congress at times by basically taking like every single case to the people will vote and everything like that. And they felt like this was undermining the constitutional system of checks and balances against him. So in 1835, you can actually say the anti-Jacksons make up a majority in the House of Representatives, but only by combining forces with a third party that was the anti-Masons at this time. So when it comes to 1836, they were actually strong enough to mount a serious challenge for the presidency. This would have been, at that point, Jackson's already done his 2 terms, and so this is when Martin Van Buren is running for the presidency as the Democrat candidate. But the thing is, the Whigs, rather than running just one candidate, they actually ran 3 different regional candidates. And the hope was just to keep Martin Van Buren from having a majority of the Electoral College, which would then throw the race into the House of Representatives, where they knew a Whig candidate would actually take the presidency. The thing is, they fail at this, and you can see here Martin Van Buren just manages to keep on a majority of the Electoral College and thus win the presidency. So what are they really building their party on, though? A lot of it was they claimed that they could best defend the Republican liberties of the people by, they would say that we wanted a president for the people, not a president of a party. And so there's this huge Whig belief that, parties undermine individual liberties and undermine like public good because it fosters and rewards like selfish interests of the party faithful rather than like what's the best for the country. The big thing, though, that really helps the Whigs out is they're a lot quicker to embrace economic change, especially in the form of like banks and manufacturing and corporations and such. And so they really wanted the government to be like this positive force that would promote economic development. Now, this kind of economic program does appeal to Americans that might benefit from this kind of economic change, or were at least expecting to benefit from it. So it'd be things like commercial or planting interests in the South, bankers, manufacturers, small town entrepreneurs. The thing is, a lot of these people were also native-born Protestants of New England, and a lot of them were caught up in the religious revivals of the 1820s, as well as like the 1830s. We're going to see some reform movements during this time later, and a lot of these individuals wanted to like promote social progress and harmony. They wanted a more interventionist government. So it would be things like they wanted to prohibit the consumption of alcohol. They wanted to preserve the sanctity of the Protestant Sabbath. They wanted the government to set up institutions that would help care for orphans, or institutions that might help the physically handicapped or the mentally ill by like putting them in state-run asylums or hospitals. A lot of this reform impulse, though, while it sounds like great in theory, a lot of it was specifically directed against non-English and Catholic immigrants in particular, that they're like, oh, these are the people that need to be taught the true virtues of, self-control and disciplined work habits and everything. So you see some nativism kind of coming in here. Not coincidentally, these other groups, the Catholic immigrants and these non-English groups, tended to also be the most loyal Democrats. So you're seeing an element of race and ethnicity getting involved in politics here.